A bill that's not new to Texas, but one that some lawmakers are hoping ends up on the governor's desk.
A Texas House committee heard testimony earlier this week about a law that would require the 10 Commandments be put in public classrooms. KLTV's Michael Richardson reports on why some are for it and others against it.
The House Public Education Committee listened to arguments for and against Senate Bill 10 Wednesday morning, a law that would require the 10 Commandments to be displayed in public school classrooms. Republican Representative Candy Noble authored the House's version of the legislation.
The displaying of the 10 Commandments in our Texas classrooms will bring back this historic tradition of recognizing America's foundational heritage in both our educational and judicial systems.
Democratic Representative James Tallarico, who is studying to become a minister, worries the law will make some students feel left out.
Once the government can start dictating something like the true text of the 10 Commandments, what is to stop the government from dictating the true meaning of the gospel or the true meaning of the sacraments?
Several citizens testified in favor of the bill.
We are returning to what our founding fathers assumed and affirmed, that morality is essential to liberty and that God is the source of both.
Others spoke out against it.
As one who is not religious myself, I don't believe that morality is derived necessarily from religious texts like the 10 Commandments.
The legislation has been reported favorably, meaning it's closer to a vote in the House chamber. Michael Richardson, KLTV 7 News.
Senate Bill 10 would require schools to accept donations of appropriate 10 Commandments posters if they do not already have them. If it's signed into law, the act would take effect at the start of the upcoming school